It's the Ghost of Christmas Past, Spookaroos. This is our very first Christmas episode. Well, a replay of our very first Christmas episode. So I hope you will enjoy that. I hope you have a wonderful holiday. But of course, before we dive into it, because we're talking an old episode here, it's got all the old stuff attached to it. That means the old show title and the old social media links and all that kind of stuff. So let me update those for you real quick. The show is now called Spooky Times with Eric D. And that's me, your host, Eric D. And we are on Instagram at Spooky Times with Eric D. See how that works? Title of the show, title of the Instagram account, works perfectly. Guess where you can find us on Facebook? Facebook.com/Spooky Times with Eric D. And there you can also join our closed group, the Spookaroos. And if you're in the generous Christmas giving spirit, then I invite you to check out the Patreon, patreon.com/Witchfinder. Because, of course, Spooky Times with Eric D. is a Witchfinder production. So if you pledge to the Patreon there, you're not only helping the podcast, you're also helping the Witchfinder and all my other creative endeavors. And there are more to come. I can promise you that. I have a meeting coming up next month to discuss a brand new thing. I can't even give away too much information. A brand new endeavor that I think you guys will get a kick out of. So hopefully that becomes a reality, and the only way that these things might become a reality is if we get some support, and some of that support could come from you, and that support could be in the donations that you give to the Patreon. And I can't thank those of you who are already donating to the Patreon enough. It means the world to me, especially here at this Christmas time, this holiday season. And I hope, like I said before, that you all have a very happy holiday and a wonderful, wonderful new year. Now enjoy this episode from December of 2016. I want to ask you guys something too. I'm going to talk a little bit later on about a kind of a strange tradition that we had in my household on Christmas morning. Do you guys have any strange, I'm not even saying necessarily spooky, but just unusual Christmas traditions? There's certain things that all people do, but there's some things that just seem kind of particular to your family. If you have something that's like a little bit unusual going on in your family, go ahead, write into spookyasshit@gmail.com and tell me about it. And if it's spooky, all the better. Don't get me wrong. I'd love it if it was a spooky tradition. But if it's not, that's okay too. I'd like to hear those kind of things too. I was going to do a full episode about Krampus. Some of you may have heard of him. I may or may not get to it this year. If we don't get to it this year, hopefully there's always next year. I was trying to schedule somebody to come in and talk with me about Krampus, and it didn't work out. So this is essentially slightly early, our Christmas episode, and it's not about Krampus, but it is Christmassy. We are officially in Christmas season, so tonight I thought it would be good to spread a little Christmas cheer. And what better way to do that than by talking about ghosts, actual Christmas spirit. Now, if you're familiar with the Andy Williams song, It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year, there may be a line that stuck out to you if you were a spooky kid like I was. There's one part where he sings, "There'll be scary ghost stories and tales of old glories from Christmases long, long ago." Well, old glories, okay, I understand, but ghost stories, scary ghost stories nonetheless. Where did that come from? It got me wondering. I've wondered about it for a long time, actually, and the only answer I could come up with was that he got it from Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Everybody knows the story of the Christmas Carol, right? Scrooge, he's a miserly old man. His nephew tries to get him to celebrate Christmas. His clerk tries to get him to celebrate Christmas. But he's just an old grump. He doesn't care about Christmas. And he says bah humbug to everything until he's visited by the spirit of his former business partner, who's all in chains and basically being tortured in the afterlife by the sins that he committed while he was on Earth. And he's come to warn Scrooge and say, hey, listen, you're going to be visited by some ghosts. They're going to show you some things, and hopefully it will turn your life around. And of course, Scrooge is visited by the ghost of Christmas past, present, and scariest of all, the Grim Reaper-looking one, the ghost of Christmas yet to come, or Christmas future. Now, we're not going to go into too much detail on Christmas Carol and all that, because we actually got something more interesting to talk about. See, I thought that these were the ghost stories he was referring to in that song. It's the most wonderful time of the year. Even though it's not a very scary story. Even so, I believe that the idea of ghost having anything at all to do with Christmas was the direct influence of the Charles Dickens story. But a little research has turned that idea on its head. Because guess what? The now nearly forgotten tradition of telling ghost stories on Christmas Eve influenced Dickens to include ghosts in his story. That's right. We have forgotten about it now for the most part, but it used to be traditional to tell ghost stories on Christmas Eve. Before we really delve into ghost stories, I gotta explain a little bit of the history of Christmas. We're not going to get too far into it because that's not what this podcast is about. That's for another day. But you do need a little bit of understanding here. Christmas had essentially fallen out of favor in England by the time of the English Civil War of the 1600s. There was this huge anti-Catholic backlash sweeping the land because the Catholics were considered too pagan. We talked about this before with the Halloween special, the history of Halloween, so you can learn more about it there if you would like to. As the Lord Protector of England during this time, the Puritan leader Oliver Cromwell tried to ban the celebration of Christmas and other Christian holidays throughout England. Side note, in fact, Christmas was banned in the Puritan-ruled colony of America. Now, to bolster his argument against Christmas, Cromwell cited the Bible, stating that the only day that the Bible asks Christians to celebrate is the Sabbath day, and any other holy days were invented by man. They were not for the glory of God, they were for the indulgence of man. And, he asked, where did the idea of Christ being born on December 25th come from anyway? Cromwell correctly argued that December 25th was selected by the Catholics because of its connection with pagan festivals like Yule, which marked the winter solstice. At best, he claimed, this was a cheap ploy used by the Pope and the other Catholics to trick ignorant pagans into becoming Catholics. At worst, it may be, in fact, a satanic plot. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Again, this is not a mainstream Christian idea, I wouldn't say, but there are factions of Christianity that are very against Catholicism and basically consider it a satanic cult. And it is in part because of these reasons, because they celebrate holidays in essentially a pagan way. Christmas trees, Yule logs, holly berries, Santa Claus instead of celebrating Jesus, all that stuff. By the way, side note, my mom was concerned. I was raised Catholic, and my mom was concerned that the Christ was being taken out of Christmas. So when I was a child, she used to we had a little nativity scene, a ceramic nativity scene, and she would take the baby Jesus in the little manger, and she would place that on a cake, and we would have to gather around it on Christmas morning and sing Happy Birthday to Jesus after we opened our presents. Well, at least we got cake first thing in the morning. Anyway, Oliver Cromwell was not successful in getting Christmas banned, because as we've learned with Halloween, you can't keep a good holiday down. Although many of the trappings of the holiday had begun to fade away, remnants still remained, and one of those remnants was the telling of ghost stories on Christmas Eve. So it was when Dickens, faced with a pressing Christmas-time deadline and in need of a story and quick, chose to write a ghost story. A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens is, of course, not only the most famous Christmas ghost story, but also just one of the most famous stories in the Western world, if not the most famous. There's been about a bazillion movie adaptations. I'm forced to go see it every single year with a friend of mine who comes from out of state to see a production of it that is performed here. I especially enjoy the Muppet Christmas Carol or the Patrick Stewart version. Now, there are some who argue that Dickens' Christmas Carol is, in fact, what saved Christmas over in England. Through it, he created an idealized picture of what Christmas could be, and referenced many old traditions that people long to go back to. There is a little bit of Christianity referenced in Christmas Carol, but the ideas actually are very secular. Be good to people, be generous, help those in need, and be around your family, love your family, spend time with your family. Take care of those less fortunate. Of course, those are included in Christian ideals, but they are not necessarily strictly Christian ideals. So it was a story that was accessible to all and has become hugely popular all over the world. The success of A Christmas Carol certainly inspired other writers to try their hand at writing Christmas ghost stories. One of the more famous ghostwriters was M.R. James, the provost of King's College in Cambridge during the late 1800s. He would invite a select few students and some friends to his quarters each year on Christmas Eve. Once the group had settled in and had a few drinks in them, he would read one of the ghost stories that he himself had written. These stories were published and remain popular even to this day. It was even turned into a TV show starring Christopher Lee as M.R. James himself. You can find this show, called Christmas Ghost Stories, appropriately enough, on YouTube. It's not the most exciting show, but it does kind of give you a feel for what it might have been like to be at King's College, sitting down, and of course Christopher Lee is a great narrator. But the way it's filmed, the show itself is not all that exciting. They're not like truly terrifying stories. But worth checking out anyway. Christopher Lee is always good. So now we ask ourselves, why did we stop telling ghost stories at Christmas? And I found a lot of articles about the Victorian ghost stories and how it was a tradition, and people want to go back to it, and we should tell ghost stories on Christmas Eve. But I didn't find much telling us why the ghost stories stopped. It looks like there isn't really one agreed upon set answer, but it could be things like the Industrial Revolution. Machines were getting thrown into the mix, people were working later, there were factories, there was a growing middle class. There were all these things. Maybe people were just too busy to be sitting around telling ghost stories, thinking up ghost stories. There was also world wars at the beginning of the century. Again, people had their hands full. When we learned about Halloween on the Halloween special, Halloween parties had been popular, and then they sort of fell out of favor because it was seen as basically like a little bit gauche, a little bit tacky to be throwing parties during wartime when you're supposed to be doing your part for the war effort. There's also technological advances that may have played a part. The introduction of electricity, perhaps, made ghost stories less appealing. You're not sitting around a fire anymore. You have electricity lighting up your home. You also have more work that you can be doing at night. But of course, something else that might figure into it is the rise of Halloween. As we said before, Halloween is essentially a very American holiday. But as Halloween began to rise, it's possible that the idea just shifted. Well, we already have Halloween. That's a good time for ghost stories, ghost stories, ghost stories, monsters, ghosts. And it all shifts to Halloween instead of Christmas Eve. Now, I thought it would be interesting to share with you an example of a Victorian ghost story. Now, of course, I'm not just going to sit and read A Christmas Carol to you. Plus, you already know that one. You've probably heard it a million times. I love it, but even there's limits, But I wanted to find one that maybe we haven't heard yet. Problem is, a lot of them are long. It's the same problem like, say, with a Washington Irving story. Yeah, it's called a short story, but it's still like pages and pages and, even like chapters long sometimes. It's short, but it's not that short. But there is a rather well-known book by a man named Jerome K. Jerome called Told After Supper. It was published in 1891, and it is full of Christmas ghost stories that are not terribly long. So I'm going to read you an abridged version of a story plus an introduction from this book. So here we go. I may try to do voices. I'm not making any promises. We'll see what comes out. Told After Supper by Jerome K. Jerome, 1891. An introduction. It was Christmas Eve. Of course, as a mere matter of information, it is quite unnecessary to mention the date at all. The experienced reader knows it was Christmas Eve without my telling him. It is always Christmas Eve in a ghost story. Christmas Eve is the Ghost Great Gala night. On Christmas Eve, they hold their annual fete. On Christmas Eve, everybody in Ghostland who is anybody, or rather, speaking of ghosts, one should say, I suppose, every nobody who is any nobody comes out to show himself or herself, to see and be seen, to promenade and display their winding sheets and grave cloths to each other, to criticize one another's style, and to sneer at one another's complexion. Why on Christmas Eve, of all nights in the year, I never could myself understand. It is invariably one of the most dismal nights to be out in, cold, muddy, and wet. And besides, at Christmas time, everybody has quite enough to put up with in the way of a houseful of living relations, without the ghost of any dead ones mooning about the place, I am sure. There must be something ghostly in the air of Christmas. Something about the close, muggy atmosphere that draws up the ghost, like the dampness of the summer rains brings out the frogs and the snails. And not only do the ghosts themselves always walk on Christmas Eve, but live people always sit and talk about them on Christmas Eve. Whenever 5 or 6 English-speaking people meet around a fire on Christmas Eve, they start telling each other ghost stories. Nothing satisfies us on Christmas Eve but to hear each other tell authentic anecdotes about specters. It is a genial, festive season, and we love to muse upon graves, and dead bodies, and murders, and blood. Let us begin with a story told to us by a young man named Teddy Biffles. He called his story Johnson and Emily, or The Faithful Ghost. I was little more than a lad when I first met with Johnson. I was home for the Christmas holidays, and it being Christmas Eve, I had been allowed to sit up very late. On opening the door of my little bedroom to go out, I found myself face to face with Johnson, who was coming out. It The neighbors could tell him was that soon after his